All right. Well, warmest afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much again for joining us for day 3 of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired advocacy events. You know, we were calling it Advocacy Days, plural. I think we should just call it Advocacy Week. So I'm changing the name officially right now. So warmest welcome to you. Today's focus is on accessibility. I want to let you know that we'll get moving. I'll share the council's work on accessibility. Richard Rydecki from the Wisconsin Elections Commission will be joining us at about 12:15. So wherever I am in my presentation, I'll pause and we'll welcome Richard. And then he'll be with us for about 15 minutes and we can ask questions of him as well. I'll finish anything that I have left from my presentation and then kick it over to Aaron to review some of the top priorities and also walk us through getting ready for those legislative visits. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So advocacy for accessibility covers several different things, and we pay a lot of attention here to where are folks hitting barriers, where are folks needing better access, because this is a pretty broad category. So currently, some of our top priorities are voting access. There's been a lot happening in the voting world, and some of it we want to use for moving access forward for those of us who are blind and visually impaired. And quite frankly, part of our work right now is being in response to several voting bills which could have negative consequences for folks with disabilities, including folks with blindness and visual impairment. So we're in response mode on voting as well, and we'll discuss both of those things. Website access continues to be a high priority for the council, and where we have the possibility to do influence is when we're talking about public websites, because they're covered under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we are focusing on state websites. Private ones fall under Title III, and they're much more difficult to advocate on. And that's where your individual advocacy really makes a difference. And then thirdly, we always keep an eye on what's happening in the service dog world. So those are our 3 access areas. And when it comes to voting, let's start there. Wisconsin currently does not have an accessible absentee ballot, so we don't have one that can be submitted to or sent to us electronically. And can't be returned electronically. I'll talk a lot more about this, and I expect that Richard will as well. It would take legislative action, so a law change essentially, in order to open up this provision for voters who need access to that absentee ballot. So that is one of our advocacy priorities on the legislative side. It would have some cost to it as well, so it's also part of a budget ask, but there are some existing systems in place that could be tapped into if we had the legal ability to send out the ballot electronically and then the legal ability to return it electronically. The technology is there. Doing it is easy enough. It really requires that legislative willpower to change the law. Also related to voting, we are working with the Elections Commission to increase the availability of a Braille ballot and large print ballots. And so they're engaging with different Braille producers around the state, including ABLE and BTLS, to look at some models for Braille ballots. That does not require a legislative change. It's an administrative change at the Elections Commission, and the work on that is moving really well. But when you talk to your legislators, you can let them know, that you need an accessible ballot and even some of what your preferred formats for that ballot to be in. We're in response mode as well to several voting bills that have been introduced, which could unintentionally limit the rights of voters with different disabilities. And I'm going to let Richard talk with you about those, and Aaron as well. And then I can fill in on some of the specific advocacy work that we are doing on those bills. We have a strong working relationship with the Wisconsin Elections Commission, and I serve on the Elections Commission's Accessibility Advisory Committee. And I'll talk a little bit more about that advisory committee when Richard joins us, because it is an outstanding way for us to help influence voter access for Wisconsin elections. So outside the voting sphere, and boy, I could talk about voting all day, but we are doing more work than just voting in accessibility. Some of our budget asks are for state websites to move into compliance with ADA accessibility. State websites, as any of us know who attempt to use them, are kind of all over the map with their accessibility. Some that are exceptionally good are the Wisconsin Elections Commission's myvote.wisconsin.gov website. Really, the primary hiccup on that website for those of us who are blind and visually impaired is uploading our ID if we don't have it already secured in the state system. And that's a barrier that we continue to look at. How do we work around? But the rest of that site is very accessible thanks to our advocacy work and partnership. Other other state websites are not so accessible. So the WisJobs website has major accessibility issues. And I hear Richard has just arrived, so I'm going to put myself on pause and welcome Richard. And then I'll come back to that website accessibility discussion, because there's some things there I want to make sure that you know about. So Richard, I'm going to pause, and I want to so warmly welcome you to the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired Advocacy Days. We've been meeting literally for days. So started out on Tuesday with kind of an overview of advocacy and the council's priorities and how to have a successful visit. Yesterday, we spent some time with Craig Thompson and looking at transportation issues. And then we are thrilled to have you join us today to talk about voter access. And thanks for making time. I know you were just a little busy this week with an election, so this is really awesome to have you here. So I'm going to turn it to you to have overview some of the work that WEC does to create greater access for folks who are blind and visually impaired. I was just telling folks about, participating in the Accessibility Advisory Committee and how much we value that and value our partnership with you. And then things that are on the radar, both budgetary and legislative, for voters to know as we go into this legislative period. So take it away, Richard.
Well, thank you, Denise, and thank you for everyone for having me. I will say I did jump on a little early, so I hope I'm not, intruding on your agenda at all.
No, I'm flexible. We can make it always work.
Awesome. Well, I do have some things that I prepared to talk to everyone about today. And then, if you have any questions, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those to the best of my ability. And if there's anything out there that we can't answer today live, I can always circle back with you or circle back with Denise and get you answers to those questions. So first, as Denise said, my name is Richard Radecki. I'm the Deputy Administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The Elections Commission is the independent state agency that oversees election administration for the state of Wisconsin. So we're about a 30 to 35 person staff. And we have a 6-person bipartisan oversight body with 3 Democratic members or 3 representatives of the Democratic Party on the commission, 3 members of or representatives of the Republican Party in the commission who are appointed by our legislative leaders and the governor. The WEC is not a legislative body, so we have a limited role in election-related legislation. So that being said, our commission passes a legislative agenda annually, and that agenda usually focuses on technical changes to statute to clarify processes and procedures. What it doesn't do um, is recommend, you know, big ticket policy changes. We think that is the purview of the legislature themselves and the members of the legislature. So, you know, our commission historically has shied away from making, you know, kind of big ticket policy based suggestions as part of their legislative agenda. Um, so, how does the WEC interact with the legislative process? And I think I can identify three different ways. So the first is when our legislators are discussing potential changes to election law, we engage in discussions with them. You know, we informally or formally. So between their staff and the Legislative Reference Bureau, who drafts bills, we will discuss any potential changes they have, how those changes interact with current statute, what kind of administrative, you know, problems or changes or challenges, you know, those things might face. So, you know, before a bill even gets introduced, when it's in the drafting stages, there's a chance that we've worked with the legislation, work with the legislative office in question or the staff at the Legislative Reference Bureau on that to try to identify, you know, any unintended consequences and any potential conflicts between, you know, federal law, which we are all subject to, and some of the state law that's being drafted. So the second thing that we'll do as part of the legislative process is we'll draft and present testimony for public hearings on election-related bills. We don't always do this, but if we're specifically if we're invited, we will show up to a legislative hearing and provide testimony, or if we feel that that a bill or series of bills is so impactful that it's appropriate for the commission to weigh in, just so that the public and the legislators and stakeholders understand, you know, exactly what the impacts of these changes are. We will provide testimony. So in that case, in those situations, you know, we don't register in favor or against any potential legislation. We usually don't anyway. It's very rare, and I can't recall very many instances, if any at all, in which we have done that in the past, where we've registered in favor or against any specific bill. Our testimony is always provided as information only, and it really sticks to the facts, right? It's a fact-based accounting of the procedural changes that are being suggested or mandated by the bills in question, and how that it would impact voters, election officials, candidates, etc. And the third way that we participate in this process is by submitting fiscal estimates when required. So not every bill that is introduced has a fiscal component to it, but many of them do. So this process involves us analyzing legislation and determining estimates which outline potential costs associated with each bill. And a lot of times the legislature will ask us to differentiate between potential state level costs and local costs, and then also identify which ones of these costs are mandatory or permissive or optional costs. Because not every change in statute is a you know creates a new requirement for a municipality or an election official or a candidate. Some of them just create options. And you know, we have the most decentralized election system in the country, or at least one of the two most decentralized election systems in the country, meaning that we administer our elections here in Wisconsin on the municipal level. So we have 1,850 town, village, and city municipal clerks who are their chief election official in their jurisdiction, and that creates a number of challenges for us and for our legislature to try to pass bills and create a system that works well for the Milwaukees of the world and all the way down to the smallest of our municipalities who may have between 30 and 50 registered voters. And other states do this a little differently. They do it on the county level, where the county clerk is the election official in charge of elections in each county, and that would simplify things a great deal in our state, right? We have 72 counties, and that would be 72 people plus their staff that we'd have to interact with and train and keep on the same page. Instead, we have 1,850 individual clerks that we're required to keep on the same page, in addition to those 72 county clerks. So it's a unique system, but it also allows for a great deal of local control. And it also allows for some flexibility on the local level and the level of services that are provided when it comes to elections for each Wisconsin municipality. So those are the three main ways that we interact with the legislative process. I did mention earlier that the commission does pass the legislative agenda each year. And this year they met in March and did pass an agenda, and it contained three main additions. And I don't think that any of these are terribly specific to some of the interests that we work with on the accessibility advisory group, but they impact all voters. And so I'll provide a quick outline of those, and then I'll talk a little bit about the existing legislative agenda that the commission has been working on with the legislature for a number of years now, and point out some areas of interest in that existing legislative agenda, and then we'll see if anyone has any questions. So the first item that the commission passed as part of their legislative agenda is an adjustment to the spring election cycle absentee ballot deadlines when there is a federal office on the ballot. And this only happens once every 4 years, when our April election is also our presidential preference vote, right? So our office of president is a federal election. That's a federal office, but it's tacked on to the top of our normal April ballot, which, and obviously on Tuesday, we just had our spring election, statewide election, where we had the state superintendent for the Department of Public Instruction on the top of the ballot. Well, in every 4 years, when we do our presidential preference vote, it's in addition to our spring election vote. So it's a very unique setup where we have a partisan contest where voters are being asked to choose a party whose primary they want to participate in that primary, and then vote in all of the rest of the nonpartisan offices that are open to everyone to participate in on the rest of their ballot. So the reason why the commission addressed this specific scenario is because federal elections or offices that have elections that have federal offices on them have very specific ballot deadlines to accommodate our military and overseas voters. And essentially what that means is federal law requires ballots for federal elections to be sent out to our military and overseas voters at least 45 days in advance prior to the election. And I'm someone who's not terribly good at numbers and math, but I don't need a statistics degree to tell you or to find out that in between our spring primary, which for example, this year was on February 16th, and our April election, which was just on Tuesday, so April 6th, there aren't even 45 days in between those elections. So there's virtually no way to meet that federal requirement to send those ballots out prior to that federal deadline. Because election results take time to be certified. A certification of election results doesn't happen on election night, despite the fact that the AP may call a race for a specific candidate. Election results are certified on all three different levels of government. So they start by being certified on the municipal level on election night or the day after. Then those those results are provided to the county, and the county provides a certification on those results as well before they submit them to the state, where the state ultimately certifies the final results of the election. And that takes 2 to 3 weeks to complete that entire process. So what would happen in these cases to meet the federal deadline, our clerks would have to send out what we call an A ballot. So like essentially a preliminary ballot to all of our voters with absentee requests on file to meet that federal and state deadline. And then once the results from the primary were certified, they would have to follow up with what we call a B ballot, a final ballot that would have all of the contests and candidates as certified after the primary on that ballot. So what you have here is a lot of administrative work on the part of the clerks, but also a lot of potential confusion on the part of the voters. Why am I getting two ballots? Why are they different? Which one should I vote? If I voted the first one already, the A ballot, and returned it, is it going to get rejected? Is it going to get counted? What happens if I, vote the A ballot and return it, and then also vote my B ballot and return it? Did I double vote? Did I commit a crime? How does that handle? So in order to try to alleviate that confusion, the commission is recommending that because we can't really move those deadlines around all that much, that the only people eligible to receive that preliminary A ballot would be our military and overseas voters. And all the rest of the absentee voters who have a request on file, be it folks on the permanent absentee list or folks who are just looking to vote absentee for that specific election, would not have to, our clerks wouldn't have to meet that 45-day deadline for them. They could meet the regular 21-day deadline and get those ballots out to voters, so that they're only getting that final complete B ballot, and they're not getting multiple ballots, and to avoid that confusion for the rest of our voters. And then it makes it confusing on election night, because then our poll workers are stuck going, which one of these do I count? Do I count the A ballot? Do I count the B ballot? We definitely shouldn't be counting them both. So we think that would be a welcome change, and our commission agreed. The second thing is really a timing issue that the commission passed that they would like to see the legislature address when it comes to calling a special election for U.S. Senate or representative in Congress. Now, these are pretty rare, but of course we had one last year in 2020 because, what didn't we have in 2020, right? Except for maybe reality or not reality, but normalcy. I think we can probably say the one thing we didn't have in 2020 was normalcy. But in elections, we pretty much had the whole kitchen sink thrown at us, and including a special election for a congressional seat after then Congressman Duffy resigned. So Congressional District 7 had an additional federal election on the calendar last year. And basically what this would do is just change the scheduling requirements and statute to make sure that we can comply with federal law and make sure that that these can be scheduled as efficiently as possible. They don't really change much to voters here. But it is something that is an administrative headache if these vacancies do occur, especially in a year where there's a federal election later on in the fall, like there was last year. And then the last thing that our commission added to their existing legislative agenda in their March meeting was a suggestion to the legislature that they adjust the canvass and certification timeframes. And as I mentioned earlier, the canvass process takes about 3 weeks to complete, and all three levels of government, local, county, and state, have to certify their results. And in this case, the locals, the municipal level, they have the shortest period of time to certify their results, followed by the county, and then the state gets a whole bunch of time. We get the most amount of time out of anyone to certify our results and finalize those. And what we're suggesting is is to not necessarily change the total timeline where the state needs to have results finalized and certified, but to give more flexibility to the municipalities to get their election results certified. Because we think we have plenty of time, translation, too much time, and that some of that time can be better spent giving it to the municipalities to make sure that they have all the data and information they need to certify accurate election results on the local level before passing those on to the county. and then having those eventually end up in our office where we certify them on the state level. So it's a little bit of a mechanical change. It doesn't change the final certification timeline, but it does give our municipalities some flexibility there. And I think those kind of give you a flavor for some of the types of changes our commission is willing to consider as part of their legislative agenda. And I mentioned earlier that these three additions were in addition to their existing legislative agenda. And currently there are three bills that have been introduced in the last two legislative sessions that attempt to acknowledge and accommodate some of the other changes that are in the commission's existing legislative agenda that have been on that agenda for a number of years now. Some of them have been on that legislative agenda for over 10 years and haven't been addressed yet. So for organizational purposes, the LRB who drafted these bills has kind of organized them into one bill that focuses on voter registration changes, one that focuses on absentee voting changes, and one that's kind of a catch-all for the rest of the changes. And we're not going to go through all of them because that would take too long and it would bore you to pieces because there's about 35 or 40 different clauses there. But I did identify a handful that I think might be of interest to this group. And the first one is some changes to curbside voting. We think that this change would streamline the curbside voting process to actually pair the statute up with the current administrative procedures that we prescribe in our curbside voting guide. And currently the statute is the wording of the statute is a little awkward and creates a couple extra steps for voters that want to vote curbside that we don't think are necessary and that just create an undue burden. And what the changes would do is marry the statutory language with an administrative process that we think works well for voters. I will say that it does create a new form for the curbside voter to sign, which is similar to the same thing that the voter would have to sign if they were voting inside the polling place in the voting area. So all of our voters are required to sign the poll book. And our curbside voters are currently exempt. So this would create a form that our curbside voters would have to sign as part of that process. Now, as with signing the poll book inside the polling place, if a voter was unable to sign due to disability, an exemption would be available for those voters. So it wouldn't be creating kind of a barrier to participation for voters who needed to vote curbside. If they're unable to sign, they would be eligible for that exemption, just like they would if they got to the poll book inside the polling place and had difficulty signing. The second thing that I thought would be of interest to folks is we're recommending some updated changes to the guardianship language in the election statutes. Now, this doesn't attempt to make changes to the guardianship process overall. What it does is acknowledge that the guardianship process has changed over the years, and those statutes that govern the guardianship were updated a number of years ago, but that whoever made those updates to the guardianship statutes didn't catch the track back to the election statutes and didn't fix that. So currently, the the guardianship language and statute when it comes to voting refers to the former process where voting was restricted unless otherwise noted during the guardianship process. And they weren't updated when that process was changed. So now we know that the right to voting has to be specifically identified as part of that guardianship or order that the court issues. And we just think that statute should reflect that, because right now, if you read it in plain language, it's confusing because it refers to a process that has been updated and changed, and some of those steps that no longer exist. Another thing that is included in our existing legislative agenda is a couple different proof of residence changes for voter registration options. So current law says that a paycheck with the voter's name and address can be used for proof of residence when they're registering to vote, right? Because everyone's got to prove their name and prove their address when they're registering to vote. Now, most people don't receive a physical paycheck anymore, and if they do, they have to take it to the bank and actually submit that, in order to have that check cashed, and they don't retain possession of that. And now with online banking and mobile deposit, that's a little bit different, but basically what this change would do is say that it would create the option for a pay stub or a pay statement to be used as proof of residence rather than just the paycheck, which a lot of folks don't have access to once they deposit it. It would also add the driver license or state ID receipt that a voter receives from the Wisconsin DMV now when they go in to get a new product or renew their product to the list of proof of residence documents. We think this is currently covered because there is kind of a catch-all in the proof of residence statutes that says any document issued by a unit of government that contains the voter's current name and current address on it can be used as proof of residence. But this would just clarify that. We wouldn't have to have people fishing around for categories. It would explicitly say that you can use your driver license or ID card receipt as proof of residence because voters are already allowed to use their driver license card or state ID card as proof of residence if it contains their current name and current address. So the receipt is good enough for the DMV to issue you and allow you to vote with it as photo ID, allow you to drive with it if you are a driver, allow you to use it to prove your identity and your age for certain age-related purchases. So we think it's appropriate for it to be used as a proof of residence document as well because it contains all of that required information. And the last one I was going to talk about is just it gets a little bit inside baseball, but you got to bear with me because I think the impact on voters is pretty significant. And there is an option for municipalities in Wisconsin to choose to what is called centrally count their absentee ballots. So what that means is instead of sending all absentee ballots that are either mailed in or returned to the clerk out to the polling place where the voter would normally vote to be processed, they process and count all those absentees in a central count facility on election day. And currently about 40 to 45 Wisconsin municipalities use this option. So the vast majority of municipalities do not. You know, they organize, the clerk organizes all those ballots, they send them out to the polling place, and they're all processed along with the rest of the election day ballots. But if you're a voter in a central count municipality, the clerk or the poll workers are actually required to write your voter number on the back of your absentee ballot when they're processing it. And that voter number can be tied back to the number that you're issued on the poll book. And that all this documentation is subject to public record. So anyone with a copy of the poll list and access to the ballots could go in and map a person's ballot back to them, and suddenly that voter loses their ballot anonymity, which is required by state and federal law. So some of us are very proud of our ballot choices and don't care who knows who we support or didn't support. But some of us want to keep our ballot private, either for professional reasons or personal reasons. Maybe they fear retribution, or maybe they don't want their family to know who they're supporting. In the end, it doesn't matter why. Everyone's entitled to an anonymous ballot in the state of Wisconsin, and this administrative procedure that's still on the books jeopardizes that for some folks. So what our suggestion is that numbering requirement be removed because the reason why it exists is no longer something that's allowed to happen in statute. So there was a previous legislative change, removed an option for voters to show up at the polls on election day if they voted absentee and try to catch their ballot before it went through the machine because they changed their mind. They wanted to vote in person. Well, now the legislature has changed that. You're not allowed to do that. They changed that over 10 years ago, but they didn't catch this numbering requirement. They kept it on the books. And we don't think it adds a benefit to the process, but it does add some concerns to ballot anonymity. So we think that should be shorn up. So that's those are the kind of the prepared remarks that I have for you guys today, but I would happy to take any sort of questions that you have either about the commission's legislative agenda, the legislative process in general, the commission's role in how we help navigate that process with our legislators. Denise, I think you're on mute.
It had to happen at some point. I think, thank you so much. I think that folks don't, that was a great understanding of how the Elections Commission works and your role. And I think understanding that decentralization is particularly important for folks, because a lot of the things that provide barriers to us as voters with disabilities, some you can need to be addressed at the local level and dealing directly with your clerk. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about what happens if you attempt to address an access barrier directly with your local elections officials and you run into further barriers there, because the Elections Commission has done some really good work on accessibility complaints or concerns reporting.
Thank you. Thank you for teeing that up for me, Denise. I think that's a great point. So I think there's a number of options available to folks if they run into a barrier. Say you show up to vote on election day and the accessible voting equipment that you normally use isn't set up, isn't powered on, isn't working, or the headset's not available. Something that you need in order to be able to participate privately, independently, or snow and ice wasn't removed from the sidewalk, and you had trouble navigating the pathway or the entrance. You have options. So first and foremost, we want to hear about that, and we want to hear about it right away, because we will take direct action, we will take quick action, and we will try to get the problem corrected in real time, so that no one else has to endure the same barrier that you just had to navigate. So how can you do that? Well, you can call us directly and discuss this with me or one of our election specialists who covers this. You can submit an accessibility concern directly through our website, that we receive an email notification when we get one of these concerns. And we staff that inbox, and we make sure that we are acting on these right away. On Tuesday, we had staff people monitoring that inbox. We only got a few submissions, but we're able to act on them in real time, or as close to real time as possible. So that if someone came in at 9 a.m. and experienced a problem and they went home and wrote to us about it, hopefully by 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., that problem was fixed. So on our website, we actually have a complaint page. It outlines the various complaints that you can file, but it also gives you a portal to report an accessibility related concern. And you know what? It doesn't necessarily even need to be on election day. If you came home from the polls and you're busy, you got other things to do. Life is complicated, obviously, for everyone these days, or just in general. And you're stewing about it, and you're like, a week later, you still are, have a bad taste in your mouth about what happened on election day. Still submit that. There are always opportunities for us to conduct outreach to our local election officials, to point them in the direction of training that they can use to make sure that your experience doesn't extend to anyone else. So that's one way that you can start the ball rolling on this, is report that concern to us, either over the phone or through that complaint portal. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to be on election day, but it's helpful if we get those, if we get that feedback timely. We do have formal complaint process here in the state. Now, it is a little bit of burdensome, and it does require a complaint to be submitted. That is a sworn complaint, meaning that it has to be notarized. And that process is outlined in state law, so it's not anything that we administratively can change. State law would have to be tweaked in order to make any changes to that process. But it is a more formal process, and if you do want to submit a formal complaint, there's information about that on the website, and we can help walk you through that process. And if you do submit a formal complaint, it goes to our commission for investigation, and then more often than not, a formal ruling is made on that complaint, and then potentially corrective action can be ordered if it's found that a clerk was negligent in some of their duties. Now, that's one where you don't get that same instant gratification like you do if you pick up the phone and call, or if you submit something through that complaint, the accessibility concern page, because the formal complaint process takes a while. There's timelines that are all outlined in statute. it takes a while. It takes at least a month, if not more than that, for a complaint like that to work itself through the process. And the commission has to deliberate on that complaint in an open meeting, which they don't have regularly scheduled open meetings. Well, technically they have regularly scheduled quarterly meetings, but they do have a number of special meetings where these are addressed, but it takes a little bit longer. So if something rises to the level where you think a formal complaint is the best option, then by all means, let us know and we can help facilitate that. But if it's just something you want to get on our radar so that we can reach out to the clerk and say, hey, you know what, they didn't have the carpet in the hallway taped down and it's a tripping hazard, especially for folks who have mobility issues or have visual impairments. That we can fix with a phone call or an email and some outreach. So those are some of the main options that there are when reporting those concerns. And those issues don't fall on deaf ears. We have a in-house team led by our election specialist Brianna Hansen, who take these issues seriously and act on them in real time as quickly as possible. Brianna was actually out. We had the election on Tuesday. Brianna was out in the field yesterday doing a site visit to help that municipality increase the accessibility of their polling place for next year's election. So, this work never stops and we never take a break. So please let us know if you're seeing something that is making it more difficult for you to participate.
Awesome, Richard. Thank you. I want to just highlight a couple of other things that the Elections Commission does to create accessibility for those of us who experience barriers to voting. So a lot of clerk training on accessible voting, of which I've helped to do some of that training, and really grateful for that partnership. There's a supply program. So if you need a signature guide or a magnifying glass, there's other supplies too that clerks can order to create greater access in the polling place. There are site visits, so accessibility assessments that are done of polling places. Those were put on hold last year during COVID, and the Elections Commission does a biennial report on the state of accessibility of polling places for people with disabilities and elders. So a lot of dedication on your part to supporting all these municipal clerks in creating as accessible elections as possible. So let me check in with Lynn, who's monitoring our chat, and also open up to see if anyone would like to unmute and ask Richard a question. And then we'll close out our time with reviewing some of the current voting bills that are before the legislature and how they could impact those of us with vision impairment. So any questions for Richard?
I am seeing none in chat right now, Denise.
Okay, thanks so much for that update, Lynn. Okay. So Richard, you are welcome to stay if you would like, or you're welcome to step off, whatever works best for you. We'll be meeting until about 1 o'clock and are going to take time to finish reviewing the council's legislative agenda. And I just really want to very much thank you for taking the time today to help us understand the role of the Elections Commission, your current work to continue to fine tune the election process, and thank you for the commission's dedication to access for all voters.
Denise,
Yeah,
Denise,
go ahead, Kathy.
This is Kathy.
Yep, go for it.
I don't know if this is a federal possible change, but for absentee voters, talking about if you're confined, are they going to change that?
Yeah, Kathy, we're going to talk about that. So I want to review that. It's not, I want to review that bill with everybody so we all understand it. So yes, we are going to, it's a state bill right now. So we'll talk about that next because it's a really important one for all of us to have an awareness of what's happening.
And my other question is about large print ballots.
Yep.
How large do they make them for if you request them?
So that's
request them from your local clerk?
Request them from your local clerk. and talk with your clerk about what size font you need. I know that most large print, I can't access it, but talk with your clerk and see what they're able to, because that's done at the clerk level, see what
Okay.
they're able to work out with you. And then if you're hitting barriers, talk to the Elections Commission about it. But yeah, the clerks can generally make large print ballots, and would guidance on that would be good. And Richard, I'm going to make a side note to you that guidance on that coming from the Accessible Advisory Committee would be great. ADA standard is 14 font, but most of us, there's not a prayer in the world that we can see 14 font. So
Right.
let's maybe put that on our future agenda.
Cause
Yeah,
I learned
Oh.
that from some webinar and I thought that would be helpful because it's hard to read it and you put it under a magnifier or CCTV and it's really challenging.
It's very challenging, and then you've got to mark it besides. So then you've got to
Right.
figure out how to, manipulate the pen to mark in the right spot. So yeah, yeah, really good point, Kathy. Thank you.
And how come, I know you need your ID to vote, and many of the DMVs are not on public transit, but the public library can do passport pictures. Why can't they do something with IDs for voting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is an excellent topic to bring up with your legislators, because right now state law is very specific in the types of IDs that you can use for voting purposes. And technically, the state law lists the Wisconsin state driver license and the Wisconsin state ID card as two of those documents. And we know that those have to be issued by the Wisconsin Department of Motor Vehicles. And you need to go there in most cases to obtain one of those products. And there's no flexibility under the law for the Elections Commission to work on outside of statute on this. The state law defines what an ID is for voting purposes, and it's a very specific list that our legislature has created. So any changes to that list, or any changes to the ability for any other governmental agencies to issue IDs that would be acceptable for voting purposes, would need to be made by the legislature. And I think that's a great thing for you guys to consider. And when you're having these discussions with your legislators, is to just talk about access issues like that, and how it's very difficult, and it impacts folks and requires transportation that may not always be easy for folks to obtain as well.
One of the things, Kathy, that it is a yeah, plain and simple, it's a form of discrimination. So one of the things that your legislator may say to you, depending on your legislator's viewpoint when you bring this up, because I've experienced this, is that they will say to you that Wisconsin provides a free ID for all voters, and every other cycle of renewal, you can get that renewed online. That is true, but it's still an access issue. So
Yeah.
it's definitely on the very long list of things that those of us who are doing advocacy work want to see changed. So when you talk with your legislator, I think helping them understand why the state ID is insufficient for voter access, to keep telling that story, I think is really, really critical.
They just say, oh, it's easy, just make a phone call. Well, it doesn't always.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's a great point. I think one of the other things that we hear a lot is that folks are who have concerns about being able to obtain, the ID card for voting purposes are told, well, there's other IDs on the list, and that's true, but a lot of those IDs that are on the list are not applicable to the vast majority of us. Like things like a certificate of naturalization. Well, if you're a born U.S. citizen, U.S. born citizen, you don't have a certificate of naturalization because you're not naturalized. A military ID. Well, if you're never in the military, that's not something you're going to have access to. Same thing with the veteran's ID card. If you're not a military veteran, you don't have access to that. If you're not a member of a Native American tribe, once again, not an ID that you're going to have access to. So for the vast majority of our voters, the driver license, state ID card, or the passport, which is even more difficult to obtain than the state ID card, are the main options for the voter ID. You know, also student ID. You know, if you're not in a college or university any longer, you know, that's also not an option for you when it comes to voter photo ID. So I think it's an important point to make, that the list may seem long to some, but to the vast majority of us, the list is pretty short. It's driver license, state ID card, or passport.
Kathy, great questions. Thank you. So I want to make sure we have enough time to visit those current voting bills because they, if passed, they would have concerns and consequences for voters who are blind and visually impaired. So I want to make sure you're well informed about those so you can talk with your legislators about them. So Richard, thank you. I'm really grateful for your time.
No problem. Thank you all for having me. And Denise knows where to find me if you guys have any follow-up questions. And I'd be happy to, you know, answer those and let us know if you need anything.
Marvelous. Thanks, Richard. Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you, guys.
Aaron, what I want to do is turn to you because I know you have the bill numbers in front of you. And then if you would pause at each one, I'll just make a quick statement about what the implications would be to our specific community.
Yeah, so there's about 4 bills that we are tracking that have currently been introduced. The first, which was already brought up by Kathy, relates to changes to indefinitely confined voters getting absentee ballots. And that is Assembly Bill 180, and Senate Bill 206. And essentially that would require the Elections Commission to remove every voter who applied for an absentee ballot using indefinitely confined status between March 12th, 2020 and November 3rd, 2020. So people who did that during the pandemic. And it also creates new standards going forward, specifically requiring anyone who wants to get indefinitely confined status, if they're under the age of 65, the bill would require them to get a physician to sign off to say that they are indefinitely confined. And the most impactful is it would require the Election Commission every 2 years to send a notice to everyone on the indefinitely confined voter list, saying they will be removed unless they submit a new application.
So the indefinitely confined provision is really critical for many of our voters who are older adults or for whatever reason, due to disability, age, health concern, where it's difficult to get to the polls. And indefinitely confined means you do not have to have a state ID in order to vote. You simply need to certify that you are, you qualify as indefinitely confined, and then the ballot is automatically sent to you until you request that it stops. So that's the current law, and Aaron just outlined the potential changes. This is important to our community because we do have voters who are blind and visually impaired who may use this provision for a variety of reasons, potentially age, or if they have other disabilities that make getting to the polls and obtaining an ID really difficult. So right now, this bill is not scheduled for a public hearing. And my fellow voting advocates and I are working very closely with the chair of the Senate Committee on Elections to either draft a new bill or create amendments to this one that would both appease the majority party and would protect voter rights. So, you know, once we have an action alert on this one, we'll get that out to all of you. Right now, a lot of the discussion and working back and forth and negotiations is happening on even how to change the language from calling it indefinitely confined, which is actually quite a harsh and demeaning term. So a lot of work going on here. We'll keep you informed informed about how you can advocate for this one. But if you're having conversations with your legislators now, and this would be something that would negatively impact you to lose the indefinitely confined, really important to talk with your legislator about how you would be impacted and what it would do for your ability to vote. Erin, what's another one?
Yep. So, and then again, all of these bills are state level bills, so not federal. Your state rep and your state
Good, thank you.
is who to talk to. So the next bill is related to returning absentee ballots, and that's Assembly Bill 192 and Senate Bill 203. That's authored by Representative Tyler August and Senator Dewey Strobel. And it essentially just makes changes to how people can return their absentee ballot. It would allow a municipality to designate a site other than the clerk's office where people could drop off a ballot. But voters would be limited to dropping off absentee ballots at that alternative location to just 14 days before the election, and no later than the Sunday preceding the election. And then it also makes clear who can return an absentee ballot for you if you can't do it for yourself. And it would create a process where a voter who does not have a legal guardian or an immediate family member could designate someone else, another Wisconsin resident, to return their absentee ballot for them. They would have to do something in writing to allow the other person who's not a family member to return the ballot. And then it prohibits people from returning more than one absentee ballot for a non-family member.
So this has obvious implications for those of us who face transportation barriers, because if we're voting absentee, we might hand our ballot over to a family member, a friend, a neighbor who can run it to the clerk's office for us, or take it to a drop box, or drop it at our polling place on election day. And this is kind of known as ballot harvesting. So you're kind of picking up ballots and you're taking them, and it would put significant limitations on who can do that on our behalf, and that we would have to file who that person is. So if that person that we filed for isn't available, then we lose the ability to have our ballot carried by someone else to be dropped off, someone of our choosing and someone that we trust. So again, this is a measure that we want to let legislators know we have significant concerns about, and what the ramifications would be for you as a voter if you were limited in who could drop off your ballot.
Okay, and then the next bill is related to processes for absentee voting, and it's Assembly Bill 201 and Senate Bill 204, authored by Representative Rick Gundrum and Senator Dewey Strobel. This would eliminate the option for Wisconsin voters, other than military voters, to request that they receive an absentee ballot every election. It would create an option for indefinitely confined voters to request that they receive an absentee ballot application be sent to them every election, but they would not be able to get a ballot automatically sent to them. Also, it says voters applying for an absentee ballot using indefinitely confined status would have to return a copy of a photo ID with their absentee ballot application. As Denise said, right now under current law, indefinitely confined voters are exempt from this. That would change that. It also prohibits clerks or the Elections Commission from sending an absentee ballot application or absentee ballot to a voter unless they have explicitly requested one. This comes from during COVID-19, there was a push to just automatically send absentee ballots to any voter. That would prevent something like that from happening. And then it would also require voters who request an absentee ballot electronically or by fax to provide their written signature or an electronic signature on the absentee ballot application. Current law only requires you to have your signature on the actual absentee ballot when you return this. This would add another signature requirement when you do the application.
Thanks, Erin. I don't have a lot more comment because I think the way you laid it out really points to the potential barriers that would go into place, especially around signature.
And then the final bill is related to special voting deputies, and that's Assembly Bill 179 and Senate Bill 205, authored by Representative Cindy Dukow and Senator Dewey Strobel. It would require nursing home or residential care facilities to provide a notice of when special voting deputies are going to be on the premises to family members of residents. And then it also makes it a felony for an employee of a nursing home or a residential care facility to influence a resident on whether or not they want to request a ballot, if they're going to cast a ballot, or who they want to vote for.
Thanks, Erin. So special voting deputies are a really critical support for folks living in care facilities. So if you have family members in care facilities, their right to vote really needs to be preserved and honored. And so limitations on the staff being able to, of the care facility being able to talk to a voter, and oftentimes in the check-in process or the intake process, care facilities will ask, do you want to be able to vote? And then they don't ask anything about party affiliation or who you're interested in. They're just simply asking that so that they make sure that the voter has access while they're a resident of the care facility. So this could make it potentially, there's a lot of fear about, could this make it illegal for intake workers to even ask that question during that process? So again, the preserving of the special voting deputies as it stands now would serve to really protect voters who are living in any kind of care facilities, either as an older adult or as someone living in a group home.
So those are the 4 bills that the council is tracking. So in these, just to update you on the status of where these bills are, and Denise kind of alluded to this already, all 4 of these bills in the Assembly have been referred to the Assembly Committee on Campaigns and Elections, and all 4 bills in the Senate have been referred to the Senate Committee on Elections, Election Process Reform and Ethics, very long committee name. And so the next step in the process, legislative process, for these bills to move would be for each of these committees to hold a public hearing on the bills. And so as Jean said, that has not happened yet, but that would be the next step, would be a public hearing held by the Assembly Committee and the Senate Committee. And we will update you when or if that happens.
So it's an interesting time from an advocacy standpoint, because on the voting front, we're trying to advance the ability to have an accessible electronically processed absentee ballot. So, the ability to have that ballot emailed to us, where we could interact with it using screen reader or magnification software, and where we could send it back electronically and not have to have the manage the signature on the certification envelope. So trying to do that as forward movement to create greater access. And we've been having many conversations with folks, legislators, to help them understand the importance of that and how it could connect to what happens now for military and overseas voters. There's provisions in law for that already, and the tools are there. So if that's of interest to you, talk to your legislators about the importance of that and help them understand that we have the tools. We just need to keep amending the law to create this level of access, help them understand about the value of the large print and or Braille ballot, so that gets on their radar, even though that's a municipal decision. Helping legislators understand that is really important. And then we're working really hard to make sure that we don't move backwards in our access as voters with disabilities. So it's a very interesting time for voting and voting rights for people with disabilities and people who are older adults. So if you have not already done so, please sign up on the council's webpage to get our once a month advocacy updates, because they are an excellent tool for keeping track of these sorts of things and learning more. Every article has direct actions that you can take as a member of the state community. So very concrete and specific. I will be sending sending out to you today information about a legislative briefing on the rights of voters with blindness and disabilities and older adults that we are doing for state legislators on Monday from noon to 1 o'clock. Couple action items there for you. If you would like to attend, you're more than welcome to do that. You're more than welcome to do that. You just need to register, and it'll be a Zoom webinar, and it'd be a great way to learn more about the rights of voters with disabilities in this state and what we're working to protect and advance. If you would like to share that information with your legislator and encourage them to come, that would be absolutely marvelous. So watch for that to come in your email today as well. I know several of you have heard the information about how to contact your legislator. If you need to hear that again, we will take just a quick minute to review that. We'll also be sending out that handout so you have access to it. A reminder that all of our advocacy priorities are on our webpage. And if you want to hang out for another moment to hear from Erin about how to make sure you contact your legislator, you're welcome to stay. If you're like, I've got that information already, I'm good to go, feel free to step off. Well, I want to thank you so incredibly much for all your dedication to the advocacy work on behalf of folks who are blind and visually impaired in the state. Please get those visits scheduled. And then please come back and visit with us on May 7th to share the stories of those visits. So Erin, you want to take a hot minute and just go through that, how to make sure you get in touch with your legislator?
Yeah, so as Denise said, we do have a step-by-step handout that will be coming out later, I think today, did you say?
Yeah, I'd like it to go out today. Yeah.
Great. So look for that in your inbox, but just things to keep in mind. One, if you don't know who your state representative or state senator are, there is a legislative hotline that you can call to be connected with them. And that number is on the handout that will be coming out. Otherwise, you can always go to the legislative website. It is not super accessible, but that is legis, Legis, .wisconsin.gov. And that's where you can find all the information you need about who represents you. There's a little search bar on the homepage about who your legislators are, and you can also find their phone numbers and email addresses there. When you reach out, just let them know that you are a constituent. Constituents always get preference in getting visits. And the other really important thing right now, if you want a virtual meeting, be sure to specify that when you schedule. Otherwise, the office will likely assume you are doing an in-person visit in the Capitol. So just let them know you want to be virtual. If you're vaccinated and feel comfortable going out into the community, another option is to request that you meet with the legislator in district. Most legislators are very comfortable and happy to meet with you at a coffee shop or some other location in your community when they're back home in the district. So those are kind of the main things to keep in mind when scheduling.
Erin, thank you so much for those reminders. I just want to wish everybody a fantastic day. Best of luck with your visits. One of the things that I want to remind everybody is that we are the experts on our experience. And so, find your nugget of a story that's powerful to tell and how that connects to our priorities and what you really want to see happen, and enjoy yourself in those visits. Really use them as a time to build and nurture your relationship with your legislator. So on that note, thank you so much